There's a prison just outside of Sydney that became so violent, so mismanaged, and so overrun with drugs and weapons that it was once described as a powder keg. A place where inmates were caught on camera threatening guards, running criminal operations from their cells, and where even the staff said they didn't feel safe walking the halls. But what if I told you that behind all of that chaos was a quiet, corporate giant that most Australians have never heard of? What if I told you that this same company had its hands deep in Australia's military bases, immigration detention centres, public infrastructure, Indigenous programs, and even defence contracts? The company's name is Ventia, and it's likely one of the most powerful corporations in Australia that nobody talks about. Let's start where the alarms really started going off. Parklea Correctional Centre. Parklea looks like any other high-security prison. Towering fences, barbed wire, long corridors under constant surveillance. But for the better part of 2 decades, it became one of the most notorious correctional facilities in Australia. Parklea is located in Sydney's northwestern suburbs. On paper, it was designed to house around 900 adult male inmates. But in reality, it often operated beyond capacity. Former staff and inmates have described it as completely out of control, unsafe, and in some cases, a place ruled by fear. The problems took root in 2009 when the New South Wales government made a fateful decision to privatise Parklea. The contract was awarded to the Geo Group, a US-based private prison operator with a deeply controversial global track record. At the time, privatisation was pitched as a way to reduce costs and improve efficiency. But what actually followed was over a decade of slow, structural breakdown. Under Geo's management, the prison began to unravel in ways that weren't immediately visible to the public. Staffing levels plummeted, guards were overworked, frequently inexperienced, and placed in dangerous situations without adequate support. Some were thrown into high-risk units alone, facing inmates with histories of violence, with little more than a radio and a hope that backup would arrive in time. The training was minimal, the morale was non-existent, and the turnover skyrocketed. The surveillance systems, already outdated, barely functioned. Cameras routinely failed to capture critical incidents. Security checks became less frequent. The prison's layout, originally designed for government oversight, was never updated to match the new private model. Geo cut costs where it could, but in a prison, every cut has a cost. Contraband like phones, weapons, and drugs flooded in. Criminal networks operated inside like franchises. Whole wings of the prison were dominated by gangs. Senior inmates called the shots, while guards became little more than hallway monitors. Reports of guards being assaulted became so frequent, they stopped making headlines. But the breaking point came in 2017 when a video was leaked to the media from inside the prison, showing inmates armed with a makeshift shank threatening a prison officer. The prisoners were calm and in control. The officer, by contrast, looked terrified and completely outmatched. The footage went viral, airing on national news and exposing what many insiders already knew. Parklea wasn't functioning as a correctional facility. It was a powder keg one spark away from full collapse. By this point, the writing was on the wall. Independent reports, staff testimonies, inmate complaints, and public outrage made it clear that the facility was failing on every level. Geo's management had become indefensible. After years of contract renewals, the government finally moved to end the agreement. But instead of bringing Parklea back under public control, the New South Wales government handed the contract to a new operator, MTC Broadspectrum. MTC was an American company with experience in corrections, though not without its own controversies. Broadspectrum, on the other hand, was an Australian company with deep roots in government outsourcing. Broadspectrum was already a tainted brand, rebranding as sort of damage control. And when the Parklea contract was awarded, critics immediately questioned whether this was a real solution or just a new uniform on the same broken system. Long before the Parklea contract, the company was known as Transfield Services. Back in the early 2000s, Transfield made its money handling infrastructure projects like roads, bridges, and pipelines. It was stable and predictable government work. But then came the big shift. The company started taking contracts for defense, corrections, and immigration. That's where the real money was, and that's where the real controversy began. By the 2010s, Transfield was operating Australia's offshore immigration detention centres on Manus Island and Nauru, which became global symbols of Australia's hardline border policies. These detention centres were a nightmare for the people inside. Children were held for years, adults were driven to mental collapse, suicides, self-harm, assaults, every horror that could happen in a detention system did, and through it all, Transfield kept collecting checks. After a series of investigations, protests, and international condemnation, it all came crashing down in the court of public opinion. And so, in 2015, the company rebranded, its new name being Broadspectrum. Then, not long after, another corporate shuffle. Broadspectrum was acquired by Ferrovial, a Spanish conglomerate known for highways and airports. But Ferrovial didn't like the heat coming off the detention centre legacy. It started distancing itself publicly and it stopped bidding for new immigration contracts. And soon enough, Broadspectrum was folded into another name altogether, Ventia. Ventia presented itself as a vital part of Australia's national infrastructure. A solutions provider and a critical services partner, it spoke the language of innovation and community benefit. But behind the polished website and corporate slogans was the same engine. A company built to win government contracts, keep public scrutiny to a minimum, and expand quietly across every corner of the public sector. What makes this transformation so dangerous is how effective it's been. Most Australians don't even know the name Ventia. Even fewer know the names it used to go by. But the contracts haven't stopped. In fact, if anything, they've grown. By the time Ventia took over Parklea, it wasn't a question of whether the system could be trusted again. It was a question of whether anyone even knew who was running it anymore. By the time Ventia fully absorbed Broadspectrum and took over the day-to-day operations at Parklea, the public had been promised a new beginning. That was supposed to mean better conditions, stronger oversight, and a fresh approach to rehabilitation. Politicians spoke of reform, contracts were rewritten, and press releases were optimistic. But for the people who worked inside Parklea, and especially for the people locked up there, nothing really changed. If anything, it got worse. Ventia had inherited a crisis, a facility already on the edge, plagued by deep structural issues that no rebranding could fix. But rather than confront those issues head-on, the company followed the same private sector playbook that had failed for years. Manage the optics, meet the KPIs, and keep the contract alive. In 2021, a formal inspection by the New South Wales Inspector of Custodial Services confirmed what staff and inmates had been saying all along. Parklea remained in chaos. The report was blunt. Inmates felt unsafe, guards were undertrained, under-resourced, and in many cases, unwilling to intervene during violent incidents. Some staff admitted they avoided certain units altogether. Programs that were supposed to help rehabilitate prisoners like education, mental health support, and vocational training were either critically underfunded or entirely missing. The report detailed a facility still awash in drugs and contraband. Mobile phones remained a fixture inside. Inmate-on-inmate assaults were still frequent. Even worse, the culture among staff had begun to mirror the instability inside the cells. Many were demoralized, working overtime to cover gaps in staffing. Others simply quit, leaving behind a skeleton crew of increasingly burned out officers. The inspector's report used terms like toxic workplace culture, chronic underperformance, and systemic neglect. But none of that stopped Ventia's joint venture from being paid. The company continued to receive millions in public funding to manage Parklea, because from a contractual perspective, the metrics were still being met. This is a core failure of the private prison model. Performance is measured through checklists, not outcomes. The operator's job is to prove that they've hit the required inputs: meals served, minimum staff numbers met, basic services offered, etc. On paper, it looks like everything's running, but what's missing is any serious measure of whether the system is actually working. There's no incentive to reduce violence, improve mental health outcomes, or support rehabilitation in any meaningful way. If a program technically exists, it counts, even if no one uses it. If guards are technically on shift, the requirement is met, even if they're undertrained or out of their depth. The contract doesn't care about the human impact. It cares about whether the boxes are ticked. So long as the spreadsheets add up, the contract survives. And when the operation becomes more about surviving a contract than serving a purpose, facilities like Parklea fall apart in plain sight. The public might not even hear about it until a major incident leaks to the press: a stabbing, a death in custody, a staff walkout. But those flashpoints are usually the result of years of quietly rotting systems beneath the surface. Once they hit the headlines, it's already too late. Worse still, the private model often builds in layers of legal and administrative distance between the operator and the government. That's part of the appeal for politicians. If something goes wrong, the government can say, well, that was the contractor's responsibility. If the contractor is criticized, they say, we followed the terms of the agreement. Meanwhile, real accountability disappears into the grey area between legal obligation and moral failure. So, under Ventia's management, Parklea just kept spiraling further into chaos. No amount of branding could change the fact that the prison was running exactly as intended: to check boxes, turn a profit, and turn incarceration into a commodity. By now, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Parklea was a case study in how privatized punishment looks efficient on paper and feels like collapse in real life. While most people know Ventia as a contractor, the truth is they operate more like an investment-grade machine. Their business model is about creating long-term, recurring income streams from politically sensitive services that no one else wants to touch. Unlike a traditional services company that works project to project, Ventia focuses on what the industry calls annuity-style revenue. That means long-term, locked-in deals, 5, 10, sometimes even 20 years, tied to essential public infrastructure like prisons, defense bases, public utilities, and emergency maintenance. Their operations are spread across dozens of joint ventures, public-private partnerships, and contract-based entities, which lets them absorb risk in one area while expanding in another. A bad headline in corrections won't touch their utilities division. A blowback in Indigenous housing won't affect their telecom maintenance deals. The structure is fragmented by design. Ventia is in a pretty strong position financially speaking. In 2023 alone, the company made over $5.5 billion in revenue. For every dollar Ventia earns before expenses, it keeps a big chunk in actual free cash. More than enough to grow, buy up smaller companies, or shift direction if things start getting messy. All of that makes them incredibly attractive to institutional investors and to governments. Ventia offers a tidy solution, a large, stable private operator with the scale to absorb entire portfolios of public work. Need a regional health facility maintained? They'll take it. Need military housing managed across 3 states? They'll do it. Want to bundle that with a few prisons, a traffic light system, and an Indigenous community housing contract? No problem. The messier the service, the more value Ventia can extract. And because their operations are spread across so many categories, they can price aggressively. A company that handles both prison meals and military catering creates economies of scale, fewer suppliers, and shared logistics. That's how detention becomes part of a broader strategy of government dependency. Every contract deepens the relationship. Every crisis makes it harder to unwind. And every successful tender strengthens their grip on the system. Ventia holds major contracts with the Australian Defence Force, managing everything from base logistics and infrastructure to security services, catering, transport, and facility maintenance. At first glance, this might seem like standard outsourcing. Governments routinely contract out non-combat roles to cut costs and free up military personnel. But the scale of Ventia's involvement raises deeper concerns. When one private company handles such a broad portfolio across dozens of defense sites over long-term multi-million-dollar deals, it creates strategic dependency. If that company underperforms, cuts corners, or experiences internal disruption, the fallout doesn't just affect admin paperwork, it affects how defense operations function on the ground. Delays in maintenance, failures in logistics, or disruptions in base services can ripple across entire departments. This becomes even more concerning when the company in question already has a track record of failure. Past performance matters, and in Ventia's case, the record is far from reassuring. Ventia has already shown a willingness to rebrand, restructure, and shift direction when public pressure builds. If it walked away from one sector midstream or collapsed under legal or financial scrutiny, the impact wouldn't be limited to a single contract, it would leave a vacuum across multiple systems. The same risk applies to the civil infrastructure it manages. Ventia is embedded in traffic control networks, water pipelines, energy grids, and telecommunication systems, including major contracts tied to the national broadband network. That places enormous public-facing responsibility in the hands of a company that, by design, isn't directly accountable to voters or the public. Government departments are supposed to answer to the people. Companies like Ventia answer to their board. We should also mention that Ventia holds contracts to provide services to Indigenous communities, including in remote areas. They handle housing maintenance, job training programs, and service deliveries in communities that have been underserved by the government for decades. And yet, the same company, through its lineage, has played a direct role in the incarceration of Indigenous Australians. The same entity that profited from locking up Indigenous people now profits from offering them housing. It's a cruel cycle, and one that reveals the hypocrisy of how contracts are awarded, how services are delivered, and how accountability is avoided. In 2023, the New South Wales state government announced that Parklea Correctional Centre would return to public management by 2026, ending over 15 years of private operation. But here's the thing, Ventia didn't collapse. The company didn't lose its other contracts, and there's no inquiry into how all this happened under their watch. The executives stayed where they were, the profits kept rolling in, and Parklea is just one facility among many. Because for Ventia, Parklea was just one contract in a portfolio of government deals that stretches across defense, infrastructure, immigration, utilities, and Indigenous services. Walking away from a scandal is built into the model. This is the problem. The deeper you look into Australia's history of outsourcing public services, the clearer it becomes that this was never just about cost savings or efficiency. That's the cover story. The real appeal for governments is plausible deniability. When a publicly run service fails, the minister is called to account, questions are asked, reports are tabled. But when a private company fails under contract, the blame becomes slippery. The government points to the operator points to the contract, no one takes real responsibility, and the people affected are left stuck inside a system that no longer answers to them. Privatization just buries risk behind layers of legal contracts, corporate PR, and commercial confidentiality. There's no transparency nor scrutiny, and in the absence of public pressure, the cycle repeats itself. This isn't just about Ventia, it's about what kind of country we want to live in. Do we want to keep outsourcing our most sensitive, critical services to corporations with zero democratic accountability? Do we want prisons run for profit, Indigenous communities served by contractors with histories of abuse, military logistics controlled by companies with opaque boards? Or do we want public services that are actually public? Because every time we let a company like Ventia take over, we lose a bit more control and a bit more transparency. What happened at Parklea was the logical outcome of a system that prioritized cost savings over care and profits over people. So the next time you see a no-name company win a $1 billion government contract, stop and ask, who are they really? What have they done before? And who's going to hold them accountable when things go wrong? Because if we don't ask now, we'll be asking too late. But what do you think? Let us know your thoughts and more in the comment section below, and let's discuss. And if you enjoyed this story, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss out on more deep dives like this. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.